Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for week 14, focusing on an unapologetic apologetic, the importance of Greco-Roman rhetoric for NT context. Welcome to our advanced seminar. The title of this slide is The Oral Cultures of the Biblical World and the Rationale for Rhetorical Criticism. Let us begin our deep dive into the foundational academic background of New Testament rhetoric with our first major quotation from the textbook. Ours is a text-based culture, a culture of written documents. You need look no further than your computer screens to verify this assertion. There could only be an internet age if there was widespread literacy, which in turn leads to widespread production and reading of texts. It is thus difficult for us in a text-based culture to conceive of and understand the character of an oral culture, much less understand how sacred texts function in such an oral culture. This statement demands that we radically adjust our historical imagination. We currently live in an environment that is entirely saturated with visual data, where written text is the primary vehicle for learning, communicating, and preserving human knowledge. Because we naturally project our own cultural experiences onto the past, we often approach the New Testament as if its authors operated within a similar text-centric paradigm. However, this assumption is fundamentally flawed. The Greco-Roman world of the first century, and particularly the Jewish and early Christian communities within it, were deeply embedded in oral and oral cultures. The written word, while present, was not the primary mode of engagement for the vast majority of the population. This brings us to our second profound quotation from the text. The literacy rate in those biblical cultures seems to have ranged from about 5% to 20% depending on the culture and which subgroup within the culture we are discussing. Not surprisingly then, all ancient peoples, whether literate or not, preferred the living word, which is to say the spoken word. Texts were enormously expensive to produce, papyrus was expensive, ink was expensive, and scribes were ultra-expensive. Historical research has indicated that literacy rates in these biblical cultures were astonishingly low. Producing a text in this era was an incredibly resource-intensive undertaking. Writing materials, such as papyrus imported from Egypt, were prohibitively expensive for the average person. The specialized ink required for durable writing was costly, and the highly trained professional scribes, who possessed the intricate skills necessary to produce legible and accurate manuscripts, commanded exorbitant fees for their labor. Because of these immense practical barriers, a written document was an incredibly rare and precious artifact, not a disposable item for casual, private consumption. This is precisely why, when Jesus taught the crowds, he consistently appealed to their auditory senses. He repeatedly proclaimed, "Let those who have ears, listen." He never commanded the multitudes to go home and read a scroll, because the reality was that most of them simply could not decipher the written word. Their religious instruction, their history, and their communal identity were all transmitted and sustained orally. The title of this slide is The Performative Nature of Ancient Documents and the Necessity of Oral Delivery. Let us consider our first significant quotation from the text. So far as we can tell, no documents in antiquity were intended for silent reading, and only a few were intended for private individuals to read. They were always meant to be read out loud and usually read out loud to a group of people. For the most part they were simply necessary surrogates for oral communication. This was particularly true of ancient letters. This insight completely transforms how we must interpret the New Testament epistles. When the Apostle Paul, or Peter, or John authored a letter to a distant congregation, they were not dispatching a static theological treatise meant to be filed away in a personal library. They were creating dynamic performance scripts. Because physical texts were so rare, and literacy so exclusive, the reception of a document was a communal event. A letter was designed to act as a surrogate for the author's own physical presence and commanding voice. The authors meticulously crafted these documents with their oral delivery at the forefront of their minds, intentionally embedding the Greek text with sophisticated oral devices. Now, let us move to our second quotation. In fact, most ancient documents including letters were not really texts in the modern sense at all. They were composed with their oral and oral potential in mind, and they were meant to be orally delivered when they arrive at their destination. Thus for example, when one reads the opening verses of Ephesians, loaded as it is with oral devices, it becomes perfectly clear that no one was ever meant to hear this in any language but Greek, and furthermore, no one was ever meant to read this silently. This underscores the physical constraints of ancient manuscripts. Standard Greek letters were written in scriptio continua, meaning there were absolutely no spaces between words, no punctuation marks, no paragraph breaks, and everything was written in continuous capital letters. The only practical way to comprehend such a formidable, unbroken block of text was to sound it out aloud, allowing the ear to parse the syllables and words that the eye could not easily separate. The sacred texts of early Christianity were dynamic, living events. They were meant to be passionately declaimed by a skilled reader who already understood the author's intent and could deliver the message with the proper emotional inflections, pauses, and rhetorical emphasis. This foundational reality underscores the absolute necessity of rhetorical criticism. If we are to truly comprehend the original power and purpose of the New Testament, we must analyze these documents as powerful, persuasive speeches designed to captivate the ears and hearts of an ancient, oral society. The title of this slide is Literacy, Erudition, and the Elite Status of Early Christian Authors. Let us delve into our first pivotal quotation from the text. It is too seldom taken into account that the 27 books of the NT reflect a remarkable level of literacy, and indeed of rhetorical skill amongst the inner circle of leaders of the early Christian movement. Early Christianity was not, by and large, a movement led by illiterate peasants or the socially deprived. We need to carefully dismantle a widely held, romanticized myth that exists in modern popular theology. Often, the early church is envisioned almost exclusively as a grassroots movement comprised entirely of the lowest, uneducated strata of society. While it is absolutely true that the Christian movement embraced the marginalized, the poor, and slaves, the intellectual engine of the church, the individuals who formulated its complex theology, authored its enduring documents, and successfully navigated the treacherous social and political networks of the Roman Empire, possessed a highly sophisticated educational background. Producing the 27 canonical books of the New Testament was not a task for the unlettered. It demanded profound erudition. It required a masterful command of the Greek language, an intimate, scholarly familiarity with the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, and a comprehensive mastery of Greco-Roman rhetorical conventions. This level of literary and rhetorical skill was an exclusive domain. In the ancient Mediterranean world, advanced education was an elite privilege, typically reserved for wealthy males who were meticulously groomed for public life, politics, or the legal profession. Let us transition to our second significant quotation. The leaders of the movement mostly produced the texts of the movement, and the texts of the NT reflect a considerable knowledge of Greek, of rhetoric, and indeed of general Greco-Roman culture. This skill and erudition can only seldom be attributed to scribes, except in cases where scribes such as Tertius or Sosthenes have been converted and donated their skills to the movement. The undeniable fact that early Christian leaders produced such rhetorically complex texts indicates unequivocally that they were fully engaged with, and capable of operating within, the broader Greco-Roman intellectual ecosystem. We cannot simply wave away this sophisticated composition by attributing it entirely to hired scribes. While we know with certainty that the Apostle Paul utilized amanuenses, such as Tertius, who explicitly greets the Romans, or Sosthenes, who is mentioned in the opening of 1 Corinthians, these secretaries were likely taking dictation. The overarching structural brilliance, the profound theological depth, and the intricate rhetorical strategies belonged inherently to the authors themselves. This erudition underscores the necessity of engaging with these texts on an advanced academic level, recognizing the profound intellectual capabilities of the individuals who shaped the foundations of Christian theology. The title of this slide is Sacred Words, Inherent Power, and the Treasure of Texts. Let us examine our first major quotation regarding the metaphysical function of language in antiquity. How then did a sacred text function in an oral culture? For one thing, it was believed that words, especially religious words, were not mere ciphers or symbols. They were believed to have power and effect on people if they were properly communicated and pronounced. It was not just the sacred names of God, the so-called nomina sacra, which were considered to have inherent power, but sacred words in general. To fully grasp the context of the New Testament, we must abandon our modern, often nominalistic view of language. Today, we generally view words merely as arbitrary symbols or ciphers used to convey information. However, in the ancient Mediterranean world, words possessed an ontological reality. Spoken words, particularly religious declarations, blessings, or curses, were believed to carry an inherent, active power that could physically and spiritually affect the world and the people within it. When the prophet Isaiah declared that God's word would not return void but would accomplish its purpose, he was articulating a deeply held cultural conviction. Words were active agents of divine will. Because the spoken word was so powerful, the physical document that recorded these words was treated with immense veneration. It was not merely a reference book, it was a sacred repository of divine energy. Now, let us proceed to our second quotation. From what we can tell, the texts of the NT books were treasured during the 1st century, and were lovingly and carefully copied for centuries thereafter. There is even evidence beginning in the 2nd century of the use of female Christian scribes who had a fairer hand to copy and even begin to decorate these sacred texts. But make no mistake, even such texts were seen to serve the largely oral culture. Because these texts contained the very words of a living and powerful God, the physical manuscripts were treasured beyond measure. They were incredibly expensive to produce, as we have already established, but their value transcended their material cost. They were housed in sacred spaces and handled only by those deemed pure and authorized to unroll the scroll and declaim its contents. The meticulous copying of these texts, which continued for centuries, was an act of profound devotion. Yet, the text explicitly reminds us that even with this careful preservation, the written document remained subservient to the oral culture. The text existed primarily so that the words could be spoken again and again. The physical preservation ensured that the powerful, living voice of the apostles and the prophets could continue to resonate through the assemblies of believers. Therefore, when we study the New Testament, we are studying the meticulously preserved scripts of a vibrant, powerful, and ongoing oral performance that defined early Christian worship. The title of this slide is The Dominance of Rhetorical Paradigms over Epistolary Conventions. Let us look at our first crucial quotation regarding the literary categorization of the New Testament. Given that the division between a speech and an orally performed text was more like a thin veil than a thick wall between literary categories, it will not come as a surprise when I say that actually oral conventions more shaped the so-called epistolary literature of the NT than epistolary ones, and with good reason. This was not only because of the dominant oral character of the culture, but also more importantly because the Greco-Roman world of the NT period was a rhetorically saturated environment. This observation is absolutely critical for establishing our methodology. For decades, many scholars approached the New Testament epistles primarily through the lens of ancient letter-writing conventions. They analyzed the prescripts, the thanksgiving sections, and the closing health wishes, comparing them to mundane secular papyri. However, this approach severely truncates our understanding of these massive theological documents. The Greco-Roman world was entirely saturated with rhetoric. From the law courts to the public assemblies, the art of persuasion was the dominant intellectual paradigm, tracing its roots deep into the classical era of Aristotle. In contrast, the personal letter, used as a vehicle for complex philosophical or theological instruction, was a relatively recent phenomenon, only truly gaining prominence with figures like Cicero shortly before the New Testament era. Therefore, the vast majority of the New Testament owes an infinitely larger debt to the ancient, pervasive traditions of rhetoric than it does to the nascent practice of writing letter essays. Let us turn to our second quotation to solidify this point. Analyzing the majority of the NT on the basis of epistolary conventions, many of which did not become de rigueur nor put into a handbook until after NT times, while a helpful exercise to some degree, has no business being the dominant literary paradigm by which we examine the Pauline, Petrine, Johannine, and other discourses in the NT. The dominant paradigm when it came to words and the conveying of ideas, meaning, and persuasion in the NT era was rhetoric, not epistolary conventions. If we rely solely on epistolary analysis, we are left completely unequipped to interpret the vast, body middle of these documents. Epistolary conventions tell us virtually nothing about the structural logic, the argumentative strategies, or the emotional appeals that make up 95% of a document like Romans or Hebrews. These texts are, in reality, lengthy discourses, homilies, and rhetorical speeches that the creators could not physically deliver themselves. They sent a surrogate to proclaim them. Some are straightforward sermons, while others are rhetorical speeches designed for assembly debate. Consequently, to unlock the profound structural and substantive intricacies of these texts, we must analyze them as rhetorical masterpieces. Rhetoric, and rhetoric alone, provides the necessary analytical tools to comprehend how the New Testament authors sought to shape the beliefs, behaviors, and ultimate destinies of their audiences. The title of this slide is Defining Rhetorical Criticism, Historical versus Modern Approaches. Let us direct our attention to our first quotation, which outlines the fundamental definition and the first major scholarly approach to this discipline. Rhetorical criticism is by definition the study of rhetoric, whether ancient or modern, with a broad definition of rhetoric being the art of persuasion, though sometimes it has degenerated into the art of speaking well, or mere verbal eloquence. As applied to the field of NT studies, rhetorical criticism has been approached in two rather different ways by scholars. The first way, pioneered and championed by George Kennedy and Hans Dieter Betz and their students, is more of an historical enterprise, seeking to analyze the NT documents on the basis ancient Greco-Roman rhetoric. At its absolute core, rhetoric is the intricate art of persuasion. It is the systematic study of how language is employed to influence belief and alter behavior. Within the realm of New Testament studies, the application of rhetorical criticism has bifurcated into two distinct methodological camps. The first camp, championed by towering scholars like Kennedy and Betz, represents a deeply historical enterprise. This approach insists that we must analyze the New Testament documents using the exact rhetorical categories, handbooks, and structural divisions that were prevalent in the ancient Greco-Roman world. The objective is to understand how the New Testament authors consciously or unconsciously adopted and adapted the ancient art of persuasion to communicate their revolutionary Christian message. This historical approach demands that we immerse ourselves in the educational treatises of Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian to comprehend the specific rhetorical tools available to figures like Paul. Now, let us examine the second quotation, which introduces the alternative approach. The second approach, growing out of modern language theory and modern epistemology, when it comes to the issue of texts and meaning, has been pioneered and championed by Vernon Robbins and his students. The methodological issue here is whether the NT should only be analyzed on the basis of categories the NT authors themselves could have known and used, or not. This second camp, often referred to as socio-rhetorical criticism or the new rhetoric, draws heavily upon modern linguistic theories and contemporary philosophical epistemology. It applies modern categories, such as inner texture or intratexture, to the ancient texts. While this approach can yield fascinating literary insights, it raises a massive methodological red flag. Can we accurately interpret an ancient author's intent by applying modern philosophical frameworks of which they were completely ignorant? The textbook, and indeed this seminar, forcefully insists that the primary and foundational task of any biblical scholar must be to ask the appropriate historical questions. We must seek to uncover what the ancient authors actually had in their minds. Because these ancient authors were entirely innocent and ignorant of modern rhetorical theory and postmodern epistemology, it is methodologically imperative that our primary analysis is grounded strictly in Greco-Roman or ancient Jewish rhetoric. The historical approach provides the only authentic window into how the New Testament writers actually utilized the ancient art of persuasion. The title of this slide is the application of micro-rhetoric and macro-rhetoric in the New Testament. Let us examine our first quotation to establish the baseline of rhetorical presence in the biblical texts. Most NT scholars at this juncture are quite convinced that micro-rhetoric can be found in NT documents, particularly in Paul's letters, but also elsewhere. By micro-rhetoric I mean the use of rhetorical devices within the NT documents, for instance the use of rhetorical questions, dramatic hyperbole, personification, amplification, irony, enthymemes. Even the most cautious scholars now universally acknowledge the pervasive presence of micro-rhetoric throughout the New Testament. Micro-rhetoric refers to the tactical, sentence-level literary devices employed by an author to create a specific emotional or logical impact on the listener. When Paul uses a rapid-fire series of rhetorical questions in Romans to corner his imaginary opponent, or when he utilizes dramatic hyperbole to emphasize his sufferings in 2 Corinthians, he is wielding micro-rhetoric. Furthermore, the use of enthymemes, which are essentially incomplete syllogisms where a premise is intentionally left unstated so that the audience must mentally supply it themselves, is a brilliant micro-rhetorical strategy designed to force the audience to actively participate in the logical deduction. These stylistic devices, colorful metaphors, and wordplays were not merely decorative elements, they were essential acoustic tools designed to make the oral performance of the text memorable, engaging, and highly persuasive. Let us now turn to our second quotation, which introduces a more complex structural concept. More controversial is whether macro-rhetoric is also used in the NT. By macro-rhetoric I mean whether the overall structure of some NT documents reflects the use of rhetorical categories and divisions used in ancient speeches. Those divisions are as follows: 1. Exordium, 2. Narratio, 3. Propositio, 4. Probatio, 5. Refutatio, and 6. Peroratio. While micro-rhetoric deals with the tactical details, macro-rhetoric deals with the grand, overarching architectural strategy of the entire document. Does the entire letter follow the standardized blueprint of a classical Greco-Roman oration? Detailed rhetorical analysis has convincingly demonstrated that many New Testament documents, particularly Paul's letters, 1 Peter, and homilies like Hebrews, do indeed reflect these massive macrostructures. A classical speech would typically begin with an exordium to establish the speaker's ethos and build rapport with the audience. This would be followed by a narratio, which states the pertinent facts of the case. Crucially, the speaker would then present the propositio, the central thesis statement. The bulk of the speech would comprise the probatio, the logical arguments and proofs, potentially followed by a refutatio to dismantle the opponent's claims. Finally, the speech would climax with a peroratio, a powerful summary designed to evoke deep pathos and emotional commitment from the audience. These structural divisions were applied across the three primary species of ancient rhetoric: forensic rhetoric used in law courts to argue about the past, deliberative rhetoric used in assemblies to advise on future actions, and epideictic rhetoric used in public forums to praise or blame in the present. Recognizing these macro-rhetorical frameworks is the absolute master key to unlocking the complex, sustained arguments of the New Testament. The title of this slide is The History and Evolution of Ancient Rhetoric, from Aristotle to the Sophists. Let us begin with our first quotation to establish the deep historical roots of this discipline. Rhetoric, from the Greek word, rhetoric, had a long and interesting history before any of the authors of the NT were ever born. Plato and Aristotle both discussed the matter and took part in the debate about how to define what it was. Rhetoric was to play a crucial role in the birth of democracy in the Golden Age of Greece. Aristotle weighed in on the discussion of definitions by insisting that rhetoric was the faculty of discovering the possible means of persuasion in reference to any subject whatsoever. To fully appreciate the rhetorical environment of the New Testament, we must trace its lineage back to its classical origins. Rhetoric began to be formalized by figures like Corax and Tisias in Sicily, but it truly flourished during the Golden Age of Greece. In a nascent democracy, citizens possessed choices. To enact policy in the ecclesia, the democratic assembly, individuals had to rely entirely on their ability to persuade their peers. Rhetoric was not merely an academic exercise, it was the essential mechanism of political survival and governance. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle engaged in fierce debates regarding the ethics of rhetoric. Aristotle firmly tethered rhetoric to philosophy, insisting that the ultimate purpose of persuasion should be to further the good, the expedient, and the just. For Aristotle, a true rhetorician was engaged in a noble search for truth, utilizing every available means to compel the audience toward a righteous conclusion. Let us now move to our second quotation, which outlines a darker evolution in the history of rhetoric. Though it is not completely clear at what point the division happened, there came to be two different approaches to rhetoric, one called sophistic rhetoric and the other a more serious and substantive approach. Sophistic rhetoric was to rise in popularity during the period of the Roman Empire, not least because more and more orators were afraid of expressing contrary or controversial opinions and instead focused on being eloquent. The focus turned more to the form rather than the substance of the discourse. As the Greek democracies collapsed and the authoritarian Roman Empire expanded, the social function of rhetoric underwent a dramatic and somewhat tragic transformation. In a rigid imperial hierarchy where speaking truth to absolute power could easily result in execution, orators became increasingly terrified of expressing controversial political or philosophical opinions. Consequently, a massive shift occurred. The rigorous Aristotelian pursuit of substantive truth was largely abandoned in favor of sophistic rhetoric. Sophistry prioritized dazzling verbal pyrotechnics, entertaining delivery, and pure stylistic form over actual substance. It devolved into a highly popular spectator sport, designed to thrill the crowds in the agoras and theaters without ever challenging the political status quo. The Jewish philosopher Philo scathingly dismissed this sophistic trend as mere shadowboxing. The New Testament authors navigated this exact cultural tension. They utilized the profound tools of classical rhetoric, but they vehemently rejected the empty, entertaining style of the sophists, choosing instead to employ persuasion to communicate the most serious and substantive truth imaginable, the gospel of Jesus Christ. The title of this slide is the Enkyklios Paideia, Stages of Ancient Education and the Role of the Grammarian. Let us focus on our first major quotation regarding the accessibility of learning in the ancient world. Education was of course by and large the privilege of the more elite members of society. It tells us something about the leaders of early Christianity that they could read and write, and had varying rhetorical skills as well. Generally speaking, rhetoric was part of the training of wealthy males seeking to enter the cursus honorum, climbing up the ladder of public office and pursuing a career in public life in one way or another. We must completely discard our modern notions of universal public schooling when examining the Greco-Roman world. Education was emphatically not a public good, it was an exclusive, privately funded privilege. There were no systematized public school districts spanning the Roman Empire. Therefore, obtaining an education was a direct reflection of significant wealth, social status, and a specific trajectory aimed at entering the cursus honorum, the sequential ladder of political and public offices in the empire. If an individual, such as the Apostle Paul or the evangelist Luke, possessed the ability to read, write, and deploy complex rhetoric, it immediately identifies them as having benefited from an elite socio-economic background. The educational journey itself was relatively uniform across the empire, comprising two primary stages. Let us turn to our second quotation to understand this curriculum. Essentially there were two stages, study with a grammarian and study with a philosopher or rhetorician. First-level education was oriented around the Enkyklios Paideia or the ordinary/common education. Grammar was the preserve of a very small minority indeed, and those concentrated in highly Hellenized cities. From a broad social viewpoint, therefore, grammar was an elitist activity. The first tier of the ancient educational system revolved around the Enkyklios Paideia, which translates to the common or ordinary education, roughly equivalent to a foundational liberal arts corps. Under the strict tutelage of a grammarian, young students would undergo rigorous training in reading and writing both Latin and Greek, analyzing classical literature, and studying mathematics and astronomy. The critical point that modern scholars frequently misunderstand is the social weight of this grammatical education. In our highly literate modern society, grammar is viewed as elementary. However, in a first-century world where up to 95% of the population was entirely illiterate, merely achieving the level of grammatical education placed an individual in an incredibly small, hyper-elite minority. To progress beyond the grammarian to the second stage, studying under a master rhetorician to learn the intricate arts of forensic and deliberative speech, was an even rarer accomplishment. Therefore, when we recognize that the authors of the New Testament possessed not only a grammatical education but also a sophisticated command of advanced rhetorical frameworks, we must conclude that we are analyzing the literary output of individuals who belong to the absolute intellectual and social elite of the ancient Mediterranean world. Their writings are the product of the highest echelons of ancient pedagogy. The title of our final slide is Paul's Educational Milieu and Cultural Scripts, Collectivism and Honor/Shame. Let us examine our first quotation regarding the Apostle Paul's background. Enter Paul, a native of Tarsus. Paul grew up in a bustling city of the Greco-Roman world. Sitting at the crossroads of East and West, he knew what it was like to grow up in a Roman world. As Strabo remarked, Tarsus was a leading educational center of the ancient world. Paul had one of the most important items in the ancient world, access to education. Paul of Tarsus was uniquely positioned to bridge the Jewish and Greco-Roman worlds precisely because of his elite educational pedigree. Tarsus was not a provincial backwater, it was a flourishing intellectual metropolis that rivaled Athens and Alexandria in its academic prestige. Growing up in this rhetorically charged environment, and subsequently studying under the eminent Rabbi Gamaliel in Jerusalem, Paul received an unparalleled dual education. He was a master of the Hebrew Scriptures and the Septuagint, yet he also possessed an advanced grammatical and rhetorical education that allowed him to seamlessly utilize all three major forms of Greco-Roman rhetoric. However, an elite education was not enough. To persuade an audience, a rhetorician had to navigate the deep psychological dynamics and cultural scripts of the ancient world. This brings us to our second critical quotation. Ancient cultures were, to a far greater degree than most modern cultures, collectivist cultures. By this I mean they did not promote individualism. Identity in the ancient world was largely established by what group one was a part of and by factors like geography, gender, and generation. Thirdly, all ancient cultures were honor and shame cultures. At the top of the value hierarchy in an ancient culture was not the dyadic pair of truth and falsity or life and death, but rather honor and shame. If we wish to understand New Testament rhetoric, we must completely shed our modern Western individualism. Ancient Mediterranean societies were fiercely collectivist. An individual's identity was not self-determined, it was entirely derived from their patriarchal lineage, their geographic origin, and their group affiliation. This is why salvation in the New Testament is so frequently described not merely as a private, individual transaction, but as being baptized into a collective, singular body. A master rhetorician like Paul knew how to leverage this collectivism, making powerful appeals to group loyalty and communal concord. Furthermore, these were uncompromising honor and shame cultures. The ultimate, driving pursuit of every ancient person was to secure public honor and desperately avoid public shame. In this cultural hierarchy, the preservation of honor was frequently valued far above objective truth or even life itself. People would gladly lie, or even choose death, to avoid familial disgrace. Therefore, the rhetoric of the New Testament faced a colossal, almost insurmountable challenge. It had to demand a radical transvaluation of these deeply entrenched cultural values. Early Christian rhetoricians had to persuade their audiences to elevate truth to the absolute top of the value hierarchy, even if that truth, the proclamation of a publicly shamed and crucified Messiah, brought them devastating social dishonor. Understanding these underlying cultural scripts of collectivism and honor-shame is the ultimate key to deciphering the profound psychological depth and the staggering persuasive power of New Testament rhetoric. The mandate for rhetorical preaching and exegesis. We begin with a profound assertion from our text: the text of the New Testament should be preached with full awareness of what this or that portion of a discourse was originally intended to do rhetorically. Thesis statements of discourses should be preached accordingly, arguments should be preached accordingly, perorations should be preached accordingly. Welcome, everyone, to the 14th and final week of our Advanced Graduate Seminar. Today, we are focusing on the profound conclusion and application of our overarching theme, an unapologetic apologetic regarding the importance of Greco-Roman rhetoric for the New Testament context. Throughout this course, we have journeyed deep into the ancient world, exploring how the authors of the New Testament utilized the art of persuasion to communicate the gospel. But as we reach the conclusion, we must ask ourselves, what is the ultimate purpose of this rigorous academic exercise? The answer lies in the proclamation of the text. When we recognize that a specific passage functions as a thesis statement, or a propositio, we are compelled to preach it as the foundational argument upon which the rest of the discourse rests. When we identify a section as a peroratio, we understand that its primary function is to appeal to the deeper emotions and drive the audience toward a specific resolution or action. This means that our homiletical strategies today must be intricately aligned with the rhetorical strategies of the first century. We cannot simply extract isolated verses and build theological constructs without understanding their place within the broader rhetorical architecture. The rhetorical intent must govern our exegetically and homiletical applications. If we fail to recognize this, we risk preaching a text in a way that directly contradicts its original design. For instance, treating a carefully crafted rhetorical climax as just another passing thought dilutes the power of the sermon and does a disservice to the biblical author's meticulous preparation. The structure of the text is not an accident, it is the very vehicle of its theology. This brings us to our second point from the text: ethos, logos, and pathos in a discourse must be recognized and dealt with in light of its emotive intent and content. The ancient rhetoricians understood that human beings are not merely cognitive machines, we are deeply emotional and relational creatures. Therefore, when the Apostle Paul establishes his ethos, his moral character and authority, he is doing so to build a bridge of trust with his audience. When he constructs intricate logical arguments, or logos, he is appealing to their rational faculties to dismantle false ideologies. And when he employs pathos, stirring up emotions like righteous indignation, profound sorrow, or ecstatic joy, he is moving their wills to embrace the truth of the gospel. As modern scholars and preachers, we must not shy away from the emotive content of these ancient texts. If a passage was designed to evoke tears of repentance or shouts of praise, our analysis and our delivery must reflect that reality. To ignore the pathos of a text is to strip it of its persuasive power and to fundamentally misread the author's intent. The mandate for us, therefore, is to become fully immersed in the rhetorical dimensions of the New Testament, ensuring that our interpretation and our preaching resonate with the original, dynamic power of the living Word. We must train ourselves to hear the text as the ancients heard it, not as a dry theological treatise, but as a passionate, urgent appeal to the mind, the heart, and the will. Only then can we truly do justice to the profound legacy of the New Testament writers. Overcoming methodological objections. Let us consider a critical observation from our author. In other words, this doctoral candidate realized it is not enough to just recognize and have a nodding acquaintance with what I call the micro-rhetoric of the New Testament, rhetorical questions, the use of rhetorical hyperbole and the like. As we advocate for the integration of rhetorical criticism into mainstream New Testament scholarship, we inevitably encounter significant resistance. Many scholars and students are comfortable with traditional historical critical methods that have dominated the academy for the past 2 centuries. They might be willing to acknowledge the presence of micro-rhetoric, the occasional metaphor, simile, or rhetorical question, but they hesitate to embrace the idea that entire documents are structured according to macro-rhetorical principles. However, a superficial nod to rhetorical devices is wholly inadequate. If we treat these texts simply as theological repositories or historical chronicles, we miss the driving force behind their composition. The authors of the New Testament were not merely conveying information, they were actively engaging in the art of persuasion. They were utilizing sophisticated, culturally embedded strategies to transform the minds and hearts of their listeners. To truly understand these documents, we must move beyond the surface level and engage with the structural and strategic depths of ancient rhetoric. We cannot settle for a shallow reading when the text demands a rigorous structural analysis. This leads us to a deeper requirement outlined in the text: you need to know the species of rhetoric used, you need to know where in the argument you are with a particular rhetorical unit, you need to know whether this is an argument for something, or, as in the case of Romans 9-11 or 2 Corinthians 10-13, an argument against something. The resistance to this methodology often stems from a lack of familiarity with classical education in the modern era. Yet, if we look back to the early church fathers, such as John Chrysostom, we see that they instinctively read and preached these texts rhetorically because they lived in a rhetoric-saturated culture. The idea that rhetorical analysis is some newfangled, faddish methodology is historically inaccurate. It is, in fact, the most ancient and authentic way to approach these texts. When we identify the species of rhetoric, whether it is deliberative to persuade future action, forensic to defend past actions, or epideictic to reinforce present values, we unlock the fundamental purpose of the discourse. If we misidentify a deliberative text as forensic, we will inevitably distort its theology and its application. Therefore, overcoming these methodological objections is not merely an academic debate, it is a critical necessity for recovering the true voice of the apostles and the profound, persuasive power of the New Testament. We must reclaim the heritage of the early church, reading the scriptures through the very cultural and educational lenses that shaped their creation. The historical plausibility of rhetorical education. We must confront a pervasive misconception detailed in our text. The notion that early Christianity was led by a bunch of illiterate Jewish peasants is an historical myth. Judaism in the 1st century, both in the diaspora and in Palestine, was already deeply Hellenized. For generations, a certain romanticized narrative has dominated portions of biblical scholarship, suggesting that the early followers of Jesus were entirely uneducated, rustic individuals completely isolated from the broader intellectual currents of the Greco-Roman world. This assumption has been used to argue that the authors of the New Testament could not possibly have known or utilized classical rhetorical forms. However, this perspective fundamentally ignores the historical reality of 1st century Palestine and the diaspora. The region was a vibrant, cross-cultural milieu where the Greek language and Greco-Roman customs were ubiquitous. To assume that a Jewish writer in the 1st century, especially one engaging with a broader Mediterranean audience, would be entirely ignorant of the dominant cultural and educational paradigms is a severe anachronism. The designation of Peter and John as unlettered in the book of Acts simply meant they lacked formal rabbinic training in Jerusalem, not that they were incapable of engaging in persuasive, structured discourse. They were part of a world where public speaking and rhetorical strategy were part of the very air they breathed. Our text further clarifies this reality with a powerful observation. In the New Testament we have 27 books, all of which were originally written in Greek, and all of which reflect not merely Greek diction, but Greek ideas, Greek culture, Greek influence of various sorts, including the influence of Greco-Roman rhetoric. The very fact that the New Testament was composed in Koine Greek, the lingua franca of the Roman Empire, demonstrates an intentional engagement with the wider world. The authors were utilizing the necessary tools to make their message intelligible and compelling to their contemporaries. Rhetoric was the primary vehicle for public discourse, and anyone seeking to propagate a new, world-altering movement would naturally employ the strategies of persuasion recognized by their audience. We must recognize that individuals like the Apostle Paul, who was a Roman citizen and a Pharisee, possessed a sophisticated educational background that included both profound scriptural knowledge and rigorous rhetorical training. By acknowledging the historical plausibility of their rhetorical education, we give proper credit to the strategic genius of the early Christian leaders and we open ourselves to a much richer, more accurate understanding of how their texts were designed to function in the ancient world. We must stop treating the biblical authors as isolated provincials and recognize them as masterful communicators operating at the height of ancient literary and rhetorical sophistication. The primacy of the living voice. Let us examine the nature of ancient communication as described in our text. Letters were used to convey the messages Paul would have spoken directly to his converts had he been present. They are simply part of a total communication effort that took the living voice as primary, and texts as secondary. In our modern, text-obsessed culture, it is incredibly difficult to grasp the dynamics of a society that prioritized oral communication. We tend to view written documents as the ultimate, authoritative form of communication, but in the Greco-Roman world, the living voice was paramount. A text was often viewed merely as a necessary surrogate, a stand-in for the physical presence and the spoken words of the author. When Paul wrote his epistles, he was not composing abstract theological treatises to be silently pondered in a private library. He was crafting dynamic, spoken performances meant to be delivered aloud to a gathered community. The letters were designed to replicate the experience of Paul standing in their midst, arguing, pleading, and exhorting them face to face. This understanding completely shifts our exegetically paradigm. We must analyze these documents not just for their grammatical syntax, but for their oral impact, how they sounded, how the rhythm and cadence carried the argument, and how the spoken delivery would have engaged the emotions of the listeners. If we only read with our eyes, we miss the heartbeat of the apostolic message. This concept is reinforced by a striking theological observation from our text. it is not an accident that the phrase Word of God in the New Testament never once refers to a text, rather it refers to the oral proclamation of the Gospel in Acts and in Paul, and to a living person in John and Revelation. The early Christian movement was fundamentally an evangelistic, proclaiming movement. The power of the Gospel was unleashed through the oral proclamation of the truth. Therefore, the rhetorical strategies employed in these documents were entirely subservient to this goal of oral persuasion. When a lector read a Pauline epistle to a house church, it was an event. The lector would use the appropriate tone, gestures, and emphasis, guided by the rhetorical structure embedded in the text, to bring the apostle's presence alive. If we fail to recognize the primacy of the living voice, we risk treating the New Testament as a static collection of propositions rather than the vibrant, active, and rhetorically charged communication it was always intended to be. The text is a script for a performance, and the performance is the proclamation of salvation. Deciphering oral texts in antiquity. We must consider the physical reality of ancient manuscripts as our text explains. The vast majority of texts in antiquity, especially the longer ones written in scriptio continua were, and had to be read out loud to be made sense of as they lacked separation of words, sentences, paragraphs, and yet verily they had no chapters and verses. These were oral texts. Literacy in the ancient world was a rare commodity, largely restricted to the social elite. The early Christian communities were composed of a diverse cross-section of society, meaning the majority of believers would have experienced the New Testament documents exclusively through hearing them read aloud. Furthermore, the physical nature of the manuscripts themselves, written in scriptio continua, a continuous stream of letters without spaces, punctuation, or paragraph breaks, demanded oral vocalization just to decipher the words. An ancient reader literally had to sound out the syllables to construct the sentences. This physical reality meant that the author had to embed clear oral signals within the text to guide the reader and the listening audience. The structure of the argument could not rely on visual cues like bullet points or bold headings, it had to rely on rhetorical transitions, repetition, and auditory markers. The text emphasizes the specialized role required for this process with a poignant question: why would you need a lector if you are functionally literate? Because in most all settings, including in ancient libraries, people read out loud, and a lector had the skills to do it in a rhetorically effective manner. The lector was not merely a reader, they were a performer. They were entrusted with delivering the emotional and logical weight of the author's argument. The author, knowing this, structured the text according to established rhetorical conventions, like the exordium, the propositio, and the peroratio, because these were the recognized patterns that both the trained lector and the culturally attuned audience would anticipate and understand. The audience knew how to listen for the thesis statement and how to brace themselves for the emotional climax of the conclusion. Therefore, when we interpret these texts today, we must actively work to recover this oral dimension. We must read them aloud, listening for the rhythm, the catchwords, and the rhetorical flow that guided the original, listening communities. It is through the ear, not just the eye, that the text truly reveals its structure. The fallacy of epistolary categories. We confront a major methodological shift here as the author boldly states, this word just in, there was no ancient epistolary category called the body middle. There just wasn't. For decades, New Testament scholarship has been heavily reliant on epistolary analysis, attempting to dissect the letters of Paul and others using categories derived from the study of ancient, everyday correspondence. Scholars have meticulously categorized the prescript, the thanksgiving, the body middle, and the closing greetings. While this approach is useful for understanding the opening and closing framing of a document, it utterly fails to explain the vast, complex arguments that comprise the bulk of the New Testament letters. The concept of a body middle is an artificial, modern construct that provides zero insight into the logic, the strategy, or the purpose of the author's argumentation. If we restrict ourselves to epistolary categories, we are using the wrong tools for the job. We end up trying to force profound, highly structured persuasive discourses into the mold of simple, mundane letters, which inevitably leads to misinterpretation and frustration. It is like trying to analyze the architecture of a cathedral using the blueprints for a small cottage. The text directs us to the proper framework for understanding, epistolary conventions and forms are not what shapes the vast majority of these documents, which are rightly called letters. In other words, even the letters in the New Testament are more shaped by rhetorical than by epistolary conventions. The authors of the New Testament were engaging in high-level persuasion. They were defending their apostolic authority, resolving deep community conflicts, and exhorting believers to remain faithful under persecution. These monumental tasks required the robust tools of classical rhetoric, not the simple formulas of a brief business letter. When Paul introduces a topic, he is not following an epistolary rule, he is deploying a rhetorical topos. When he structures his arguments, he is utilizing the probatio and the refutatio. We must unlearn the anachronistic reliance on epistolary analysis as our primary exegetically tool. By shifting our paradigm and recognizing that these documents are fundamentally rhetorical speeches clothed in an epistolary wrapper, we unlock the true architectonic structure of the text and gain profound insight into the author's strategic intent. This paradigm shift is non-negotiable for serious biblical scholarship. The mirage of giant chiasms versus linear rhetoric. Let us address a common structural fallacy identified in our text. This is one of the primary reasons finding gigantic chiasms in the letters of the New Testament simply doesn't work. Big chiasms have to be seen. You can't pick them out by listening to a linear reading out of a document. In recent years, it has become somewhat fashionable in biblical studies to identify massive, overarching chiastic structures that supposedly organize entire epistles. While small, localized chiasms are certainly present and can be effective rhetorical devices for emphasis, the idea that a document like 1 Corinthians is structured as one giant, intricate chiasm is historically and practically flawed. Why? Because, as we have established, these were oral texts. A listening audience, processing information sequentially in real time, simply cannot perceive a complex, multi-chapter chiastic pattern. Such structures are entirely visually dependent, they only appear when you map the text out on a page and look at it from a bird's-eye view. This is a classic example of reading a modern, text-based perspective back into an ancient, oral culture. It assumes an audience of silent readers analyzing a manuscript, rather than a congregation listening to a dynamic speech. The text quotes Dwayne Watson to reinforce this essential point. Greco-Roman rhetoric, as it is incorporated into a speech or a document, is based on a linear unfolding of a series of topics and propositions guided by the exigencies of a rhetorical situation. Ancient rhetoric was intensely practical. It was designed to move an audience from one conceptual point to the next through a logical, linear progression of thought. An orator would establish rapport, state the thesis, offer proofs, refute counterarguments, and conclude with an emotional appeal. This linear, forward-moving trajectory is what the audience expected and could follow audibly. Imposing a massive chiastic structure onto these documents completely obscures the dynamic, responsive nature of the rhetoric. It turns a passionate, persuasive speech into a static, mathematical puzzle. Therefore, our structural analysis must prioritize the linear, rhetorical arrangement of the text, the sequence of arguments designed to persuade a listening audience in a specific historical moment, rather than hunting for visually satisfying, but historically improbable, geometric patterns. We must honor the linear momentum of the apostolic argument. Macro-rhetoric revisited, ethos, logos, and pathos. We return to the foundational pillars of persuasion as described in our text, at the outset of a discourse the issues of authority, establishing rapport with the audience, and attention to what could be called the more surface emotions needed to be attended to. When we analyze a New Testament document, we must look beyond the individual figures of speech and examine the macro-rhetoric, the overarching strategy the author employs to achieve their goal. The ancients understood that effective persuasion required a holistic approach. First, the speaker had to establish their ethos, their credibility, moral character, and goodwill toward the audience. This was typically accomplished in the exordium, or introduction, ensuring the audience was receptive and well-disposed to listen. Without a strong foundation of ethos, the most logical arguments would fall on deaf ears. We see Paul doing this masterfully in his opening prayers and thanksgivings, establishing a deep relational bond before addressing difficult issues. The text outlines the subsequent progression toward the conclusion, all three species of rhetoric concluded with a final harangue, which could involve a summing up of previous arguments, an appeal to the final argument, and in any case the arousing of the deeper emotions such as love and hate. Once ethos is established, the author deploys logos, the rational arguments, proofs, and evidence designed to convince the intellect. This is the probatio phase of the discourse. But the ancients knew that logic alone rarely moves people to action. Therefore, the discourse must inevitably build toward pathos, the emotional climax designed to stir the will and compel a response. This is the primary function of the peroratio, or conclusion. The author pulls out all the stops, using vivid imagery, strong language, and direct appeals to ensure the audience not only agrees with the argument but feels its weight and urgency. Recognizing this macro-rhetorical movement from ethos, through logos, to pathos is absolutely essential for tracing the flow of thought and understanding the ultimate persuasive aim of the New Testament writers. It provides us with the definitive roadmap for navigating the apostolic letters. Flexibility in rhetorical arrangement. Let us consider the strategic adaptability of the biblical authors. The wise rhetorician will then delay dealing with the bone of contention until he has established not merely rapport, but considerable common ground with the audience, so they will listen patiently to the more difficult arguments. Rhetoric in the ancient world was not a rigid, inflexible set of rules, it was a dynamic art form that required the speaker to adapt to the specific rhetorical exigency, the problem or crisis at hand. A master rhetorician like Paul knew exactly how to read his audience and adjust his strategy accordingly. A prime example of this flexibility is the use of the technique known as insinuatio. When addressing a highly controversial topic or a resistant audience, a speaker would intentionally delay presenting the main point of conflict. Instead, they would carefully build common ground, establish trust, and weave their arguments subtly until the audience was fully prepared to hear the difficult truth. We see this brilliantly executed in Romans 9-11, where Paul delays his profound discussion on the fate of Israel until he has thoroughly established the universal scope of God's righteousness and grace. The text also highlights the intentional blending of rhetorical forms. The architectonic structure of a speech had some flexibility, and it was also okay to mix rhetoric, so for example we have an epideictic interlude in 1 Corinthians 13 in the midst of a basically deliberative discourse. While it is crucial to identify the primary species of rhetoric governing a document, whether it is deliberative, forensic, or epideictic, we must also recognize that authors freely mix these forms to achieve their goals. In 1 Corinthians, a letter primarily focused on deliberating future behavior and restoring unity, Paul inserts the breathtaking epideictic hymn to love in chapter 13. This is not a random digression, it is a calculated rhetorical strategy. By pausing to praise the supreme virtue of love, Paul shifts the emotional register and provides the ultimate foundational principle that must govern all the behavioral changes he is demanding. This flexibility demonstrates the profound sophistication of the New Testament authors, who utilized every rhetorical tool at their disposal to craft customized, highly effective persuasive discourses. They were artists of persuasion, not slaves to a rigid formula. Rhetoric on full display, prosopopia in Romans 7. We now examine one of the most misunderstood passages in Scripture. Impersonation, or prosopopia, is a rhetorical technique which falls under the heading of figures of speech and is often used to illustrate or make vivid a piece of deliberative rhetoric. Romans chapter 7, specifically verses 14 through 25, has generated endless theological debate, often centered on whether Paul is describing his own pre-Christian experience, his current struggle as a mature believer, or the general Christian condition. However, when we apply the lens of classical rhetoric, a much clearer picture emerges. The text is utilizing the advanced rhetorical technique of prosopopia, or speech in character. In this technique, the author adopts the persona of a specific historical figure or a representative type to dramatically illustrate a point. The audience, attuned to these rhetorical signals, would recognize the shift in voice and understand that the I speaking in the text is not the autobiographical voice of the author. The text reveals the true identity of the speaker in this dramatic presentation. In this case Adam is the historical figure being impersonated in Romans 7 verse 7 to 13. And the story of all those in Adam in the present in verses 14 to 25. Paul is masterfully retelling the story of the fall and its devastating consequences. He adopts the persona of Adam to describe the initial encounter with the commandment and the deceptive power of sin. He then seamlessly transitions to adopting the persona of unredeemed humanity, those who remain in Adam, struggling under the crushing weight of the law and their own sinful inclinations. This is not a description of the normative Christian life, which Paul has already characterized in chapter 6 as being freed from the dominion of sin. Rather, it is a vivid, tragic portrait of the human condition apart from the saving grace of Christ. Recognizing the use of prosopopia completely resolves the exegetically conundrum of Romans 7. It prevents us from projecting later, anachronistic theological anxieties onto Paul, and allows us to appreciate his brilliant rhetorical strategy in contrasting the despair of life in Adam with the triumphant freedom of life in the Spirit, which he will boldly declare in chapter 8. By ignoring the rhetoric, we miss the entire point of the dramatic performance. The peril of ignoring rhetorical nuance. We must summarize the critical importance of our methodology with this stark warning from our text. What I have sought to show in this lecture is that one ignores Greco-Roman rhetoric at one's peril if one wants to understand the New Testament. Throughout this seminar, we have demonstrated that ignoring the rhetorical dimension of the New Testament leads directly to misunderstanding, distortion, and theological confusion. We have seen how failing to recognize the structure of an enthymeme in the pastoral epistles leads scholars to dismiss them as disjointed ethical snippets, rather than appreciating their tightly coiled, deductive logic. We have observed how mistaking the amplification strategies of 1 John for mere redundancy obscures the author's intense, epideictic effort to reinforce core community values. We have noted that misunderstanding the nature of a rhetorical syncresis, a comparison by contrast, can lead to completely misinterpreting the theological arguments in Hebrews or Galatians. The text emphasizes the breathtaking breadth of this application across the canon. If you want to understand how Paul's arguments work, why they are arranged as they are, or why there is so much redundancy, that is, amplification, in 1 John, or why the so-called pronouncement stories in Mark are really classic rhetorical kriya, then it's time to give rhetoric its due. The application of rhetorical criticism is not limited to a few isolated verses, it unlocks the architecture and the intent of the entire New Testament corpus. It explains why Ephesians focuses so heavily on present realities through epideictic rhetoric, rather than future eschatology. It clarifies the strategic placement of speeches in Luke Acts and the formulation of the gospel narratives themselves. When we read these texts through the lens of their original rhetorical environment, the perceived inconsistencies vanish, the arguments come alive with dynamic force, and the brilliance of the authors is fully revealed. The peril of ignoring rhetoric is the peril of silencing the very strategies the biblical authors relied upon to communicate the transformative truth of the gospel. To ignore the form is to inevitably misunderstand the content. The final call, becoming a Christian rhetorician. We conclude our seminar with a powerful historical illustration and a challenge. In Paul's famous rhetorical tour de force speech in Acts 26, given before Agrippa and Festus, there comes a juncture where Festus interrupts and exclaims, "You are out of your mind. Too much learning is driving you insane." This dramatic moment in the book of Acts perfectly encapsulates the profound impact of early Christian rhetoric. Paul, standing before hostile, powerful authorities, delivers an apologia so thoroughly grounded in logic, so compellingly delivered with ethos, and so deeply infused with pathos, that it completely unnerves the Roman governor. Paul was utilizing every tool of classical persuasion, not to win a philosophical debate, but to bear witness to the resurrected Christ. His goal was nothing less than the total transformation of his audience. He was deploying the intellectual and rhetorical weapons of the Greco-Roman world to advance the kingdom of God. The text leaves us with this final, poignant thought: in closing, I rather hope instead you will reply along the lines of King Agrippa, "Almost thou persuadest me to become a Christian," or in this case, a Christian rhetorician. Our ultimate goal in studying the rhetoric of the New Testament is not merely to accumulate historical trivia or to engage in academic deciphering for its own sake. Our goal is to be profoundly shaped by the text so that we, too, might become effective communicators of the truth. By understanding how the apostles and evangelists utilized the art of persuasion, we are equipped to read the scriptures with greater clarity, to interpret them with historical integrity, and to preach them with the dynamic, life-changing power they were always intended to possess. We are called to recover the living voice of the text and to become Christian rhetoricians in our own day, unapologetically proclaiming the gospel with wisdom, conviction, and persuasive grace. Thank you for joining me in this seminar, and may you go forth to persuade the world.